Hello everyone and welcome to today's video, which focuses specifically on the language and gender section of the A-level language course. Some of you might be at schools that have picked a different module to focus on, but for those that look at language and gender, this lesson should hopefully remind you of a few of the key theorists you need to know about. So the two things I'll be covering today are what three key ideas can we take from Lakoff, Fishman and Tannen about men and women's language, and then how can we see this in context. Now, those of you who have already studied language and gender may notice that I've picked three older theorists here to focus on, as although you may want to focus the main part of your analysis on newer theories, I think looking at the older ones is always the best place to start, so you can appreciate how understanding, particularly of women's language, has developed over the time. So the first theorist I want to focus on is Robin Lakoff, who is seen as the first person to really look into language in terms of gender. I know there might be some teachers out there who don't look at her anymore, as her findings you'll see here were based off personal observations she had made rather than scientific studies, and her studies come from the 1970s. But I actually think this makes her more interesting, as it gives a picture of what people thought women's language looked like, and also it makes her theories quite easy to critique if you're writing an essay, which is something they look for the top students to be able to do. So you can see that her theories are now often referred to as the dominance model, as she argued that women's language reflected their lack of status in society compared to men in this time period. So for each of the theories we're looking at, I just wanted to give you three key ideas you can take from their studies. And you'll see for Lakoff, all of her ideas link specifically to women's language. Not all the theorists do, particularly the more modern ones, but that is what Lakoff focused on specifically. So number one, she said that women have a wider range of descriptive adjectives and diminutives to describe unimportant things. Now, if you aren't sure what a diminutive is, it's a shortened or changed name for something, like cutie or sweetie, or we've got kind of adorable and lovely as other examples of adjectives women might use more. Or if you were to change someone's name, like Nicholas, you might use the diminutive Nicky instead. Lakoff's theory was that with things like this and the specifics of what colours something is, so we've got lavender and beige as examples here, they were seen as less important topics, and therefore they are more associated with women's language as they dealt with less important things. You might be seeing through this example why this is an older theory, but it's still interesting to consider. Her example was that if a man were to say something like the wall is lavender, people might believe that he was either being sarcastic or imitating a woman, as males weren't seen to deal in trivial matters like the specific colour of something, so be more likely to say the wall is purple instead of lavender. Her second idea was that women swear less and use less slang. As you can see from my comment underneath, this idea has now been disproved, and this was seen in a study in 2005 which found that your gender actually had no impact on how much you swore. It was a lot more to do with your age and your social class. But more modern theorists have still discussed the fact that if you were to ask people which gender swears more, men or women, you might still get people claiming that it's men. So how much might that feed into the stereotypes we have of men and women's language? The third point I'm focusing on with Lakoff is that women have less assertive and forceful language. Now, I think this is the most interesting one, and it links to the next theorist as well. The idea that women are less forceful and therefore use things such as tag questions, which is when you add a question onto the end of a statement, something like, it's hot today, isn't it? Lakoff argued was because women weren't as self-assured in what they had to say, and the same goes for hedging words and less forceful statements that they might use. So the next theorist I want to look at is Pamela Fishman, and her theories from her text, The Work Women Do. And again, she originally published her work in the 70s, although a few years after Lakoff, and rather than just using personal observations, she actually recorded and analysed conversations between heterosexual couples to make her conclusions. Now, looking at this in 2022, it's interesting to note that all the couples she looked at were white, they were professionals, and they were between the ages of 25 to 35. So there is still room to critique her ideas, particularly if in class you're looking at language of people who don't fit into this specific bracket. So again, we have three key ideas here from Fishman. So she believed that women ask more questions. However, unlike Lakoff, who argued that they used tag questions as they were less forceful in their speech than men, Fishman believed that women asked more questions because then they were more likely to get a response from whoever they were talking to. She picked up that men produced more statements than women, and their statements almost always got a response back. However, this wasn't the case for the women's statements, so they would be more likely to form things as a question in order to make sure that they got a response. Her second idea was that women use twice as many attention beginnings than men when they're speaking. So things like, "this is interesting," or "look at this." And this again links to the idea of getting a response from the person they're speaking to. In these examples, that would be their husbands, and Fishman claimed that this was the women's way of saying, "pay attention to what I have to say, I can't assume you will." So she also found that women used the phrase "you know" 5 times more than men did. The final idea I'm focusing on from Fishman's work is that men use minimal responses, such as to show they're listening and to avoid having to give an actual response, and that it displayed a lack of interest in what was being said to them. Fishman noted that women used noises like as well, but they did it when men were talking to show they were listening. So again, 3 interesting ideas to think about and consider if you think these are still seen in language today. Now we come on to our final theorist of today, and the one that I think is the most interesting, Deborah Tannen and her book You Just Don't Understand, which was originally published in the early 90s. Sometimes her work is now referred to as the difference model, as she argued that men and women use language in specific ways because they're socialized differently and because men and women want different things out of their conversations. And again, like Fishman, she made her conclusions based off recordings between groups of men and women communicating with each other. So Tannen focused her ideas around 6 contrasts in the way that men and women use language. I'm going to focus specifically on 3 of these in this video, but it's worth noting down what these contrasts are. Those in black, independence, status, information, orders, advice, and conflict, are all the way men use and communicate using language, and those in blue, intimacy, support, feelings, proposals, understanding, and compromise, are the way that women use language, meaning sometimes they can be dissatisfied with each other when it comes to communication. I think what is different about Tannen compared to someone like Lakoff is that Tannen doesn't think that men's language is more dominant or that women are not forceful enough. She just theorised that we sometimes want different things from a conversation, and we could stand to learn these differences to help with communication. The first of the 3 contrasts I've decided to focus on is information versus feelings. So men tend to communicate more facts than information, women tend to be more overt about how they think and feel. And in Tannen's book, she gives clear examples. And in this example, she talks of a married couple where the woman is used to verbalising her feelings with those close to her, whereas to the male, talk is purely information, with inner thoughts being kept unverbalised. Tannen states that men might see women's need to talk about feelings as intrusive, and women might see a man's desire to not share his feelings as a rejection. The second one, orders versus proposals. Women tend to phrase things as questions, saying things like, "why don't we?" or "wouldn't it be good if?" rather than direct imperative statements. One reason this is quite a good one to think about is that it's quite easy to spot in any transcripts you might be given. And Tannen's example for this was Diana often begins statements with "let's." She might say, "let's park over there," or "let's clean up now before lunch." This makes Nathan angry. He's deciphered Diana's "let's" as a command. Like most men, he resists being told what to do. But to Diana, she is making suggestions, not demands. Like most women, she formulates her requests as proposals rather than orders. Her style of talking is a way of getting others to do what she wants, but by winning agreement first. With certain men like Nathan, this tactic backfires. If they perceive someone is trying to get them to do something indirectly, they feel manipulated and respond more resentfully than they would to a straightforward request. So, interesting one to think about. And then the final one, conflict versus compromise. In trying to prevent fights, some women refuse to oppose the will of others openly. Again, another one which might be quite easy to spot and interesting if you look at women's language, particularly women who are more open to conflict and how they're responded to compared to males. To finish, I've just picked 2 random transcripts that I've used in the past with my own classes to show where we might apply these theories. So let me now just quickly read the transcript on the screen. Doesn't matter if you know who these people are or not, but as always, as I read, just consider the genre, mode and audience alongside the use of language. So this is a Victoria Beckham interview from 1998. In this text, 24-year-old Victoria Beckham is interviewed by the American presenter Ruby Wax for her BBC One show Ruby Wax Meets. The interview takes place in a hotel room with both participants sitting on the floor. So Victoria saying, I was bullied a lot at school. Bullied in what way? Like tortured? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, not physically like beaten up or anything, but I think children are really, really mean. Do you know what I mean? Really mean, yeah. Especially if you don't have a defence. Yeah, exactly. And you know, I mean, I suppose at school to act. I mean, I did work hard at school. Do you know what I mean? At night time, I was doing my dancing classes, and that's just not the cool thing to do, I suppose, when you're a kid. So you never ended up prom queen at the end, you know, like, no, 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 no. See, it should end happy like that, but I think it did, even without being prom queen. Yeah, yeah. Right, so where do we start then with this? Well, the first thing I notice is that the participants are sitting on the floor, which seems like it's a very informal kind of place to sit, makes it a very informal conversation, and it could show a kind of intimacy between the speakers, which potentially links to Tannen's ideas of using talk to share feelings, women in particular using talk to share feelings. This is then, I would say, backed up by the very first thing that we hear Victoria say, I was bullied a lot at school. So far they are fitting the stereotypes that Tannen discusses of women's language. However, I would say that this is an interview and you expect some feelings to be shared in an interview. So that might be how we critique that idea as well and consider it in a different way. The next thing I notice is the amount of back channeling we get from both the participants. So you can see we've got yeah, we've got really mean, repeating what she said, yeah again, and then towards the end. And that shows me that this links to Fishman's ideas potentially about women using minimal responses to show that they're listening. And you could also say that it's showing support for the other speaker, like Tannen discusses. The final thing I might pick up on from this is the times that Victoria uses, do you know what I mean, as a tag question. So you see it here, do you know what I mean? And again, you've got it in this utterance as well. And I would argue that she's more using this in the way that Lakoff discusses, as a way of getting reassurance from the other speaker. Or perhaps other people might see this as her using, do you know what I mean, as a filler, instead of something like, while she thinks about what she wants to say next. You could argue that, I think, in either way, and that, as always, is the beauty of language analysis. So the final example I have is a scripted conversation from the TV comedy Friends. I thought it would be interesting to look at a scripted example to see if writers write male language in the way theorists have told us males speak. So let's quickly read this. So we've got Joey entering Central Perk, the coffee shop. Hey. Ross turns to see who it is, and seeing it's Joey, he just ignores him and turns back around. Ross, I know you're pissed off at me, but we have to talk about this. Actually we don't. Ross walks off. Fine, okay, but I gotta say technically I didn't even do anything wrong. Ross turns back. What? You didn't do anything wrong? I said I didn't technically. Okay, let's put aside that you accidentally picked up my grandmother's ring and you accidentally proposed to Rachel. Joey, look, can I just stop you right there for a second? When people do this, makes quote marks with his fingers, I don't really know what that means. You were saying? And I can even understand that you couldn't tell Rachel, but why couldn't you tell me, huh? You had all day to and you didn't. I know, I should have. Makes quote marks. I'm sorry. Not using it right, Joe. He brings his hands in closer to his face and then does it again. I'm gonna go. No, come on, Ross. Look, Ross, we have to get past this. Give me the bag. No, look, I don't know what else to do. I said I'm sorry. Joey, you should scream at me or curse me or hit me. I'm not going to hit you. Why not? You'll feel better, I'll feel better, and I know you want to. I can see it in your eyes. So I think the most obvious link to the theories we've seen today is Tannen's idea of information versus feelings. We see in this short scene Joey at the beginning saying, Ross, I know you're pissed off at me, but we have to talk about this. And Ross responding with saying, actually we don't, and trying to walk away, showing that Joey wants to talk and Ross doesn't. Potentially, therefore, Ross is acting in the stereotypical male role and Joey is being more feminine in his language. But as the scene progresses, very quickly, Ross breaks this, and you could talk about how this is much quicker than you might expect in real life speech, as it's a comedy and the scenes need to move fast. And we see Ross say, I can understand you couldn't tell Rachel, but why couldn't you tell me? You had all day to and you didn't. So now he's sharing his feelings before then wanting to leave the conversation again. They do end up in a sort of conflict, although of course it's interspersed with these kind of comedic elements to fit the genre. But this does again show Tannen's theory on male language coming into play. You could also mention that cursing is talked about at the end when Joey says, you know, hit me or curse at me, and you've got him using the word pissed at the beginning as well. So you could link that into the stereotype of men swearing more than women. What I think is most interesting towards the end is Joey's solution is that talking about the problem hasn't worked, so he turns to the idea of violence. You should scream at me or curse me or hit me. And then hopefully he's trying to think that they can move past the conflict they're having, which I can't imagine this being written if the conflict was between two of the female characters. So you can see how you can link these ideas to a variety of different texts, and you might want to have a go at looking at some other text on your own. As always, I hope you found today's video useful, and if so, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel.